Hi. So in this presentation, I'm going to go over a few things. The first thing will be the midterm specifically, both the exam itself and where we are in this process. And then I am going to try to relate that to where we're going to go in the future, with the understanding that the future is hard to predict. So I want to just kind of have you get comfortable and make sure that you're ready to take notes. I think you're going to need to make a chart and take notes. So I hope that you're able to kind of be in a place where you can do that, and that means you'll probably need to watch this more than once, and you'll probably need to watch it in pieces. So I'll try to remember to make suggestions about when would be a good time to take a break. The first thing I just want to kind of remind everyone, and this will be based on kind of conversations I've had with people all week, that this is an unprecedented moment in history, and I think that's Governor Cuomo that said that, but it's not just the global pandemic, right? That's unprecedented, meaning that this is a a new illness, and folks are still trying to figure out how to deal with it. But this is also something that CUNY itself hasn't ever had to do, and may not be doing a particularly great job, although they're very likely doing the best they can. So I'm not, I have no idea what information you're getting outside of what you tell me, and the information I'm getting. But for just one example, this week, there was some discussion about the cuts that are going to be coming to the education system here in New York. And so I think that's a pretty good example of trying to help you understand just like how unusual this situation is, because you would have thought, or I would have thought, that in this situation, given the large number of students that are kind of at a disadvantage from having to go from in-person to online education without really any support, you would think that they would put more money into the system. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through this, especially when you're thinking about power and the law. Education is bound by laws, and it is a constitutional guarantee, and it's a human right. So we want to think about when leaders fail to follow the law, and what we usually say in law school, right, or legal scholars say, the letter of the law, meaning a common sense interpretation based on a shared understanding of that sense. We want, that's what this class is really about, is trying to figure out, well, what's going on when what seems to be common sense is not. So I think the easiest way to kind of think about that is, if you were in your American government class, hopefully you heard about something called federalism. But I think it's abundantly clear in this pandemic that each state is kind of doing its own thing, and the federal government either does not have the constitutional authority, or not the competence or the ability to handle this at a national scale. So what that means is that there are federal laws, there are international laws, there are state laws, there are local laws, and those are kind of coming into conflict, especially when it comes to who responds to what. And so that's what we call the civil law, or the public law side. And that's the part that attributes or gives out roles to each of the members of government. And so what you're seeing in this kind of national confusion is a product of the constitutional arrangement. Now, people will debate and think deeply about whether this is the right arrangement or there should be some other arrangement, and very likely they'll look at other countries and see what works and what doesn't. But I want to just kind of point out that this was something that was brought up in the Federalist Papers between 1776 and 1802 as being a potential for a problem. Also, a famous French philosopher that like everybody in political science seems to quote, is Alexis de Tocqueville, and he also pointed to this kind of division of individuality. In other words, if everyone just kind of goes for their individual freedom and does whatever they want, that's going to create huge problems for the public good, and in that sense, no one will get what they want. So we want to think about it in the aspect of this state pause, right? And so that means a lot of folks, I've heard from many folks this week who are working, and they're working kind of more than they would be working, and that's including healthcare professionals, folks in law enforcement and security, and in the service industry. And so there's some of you are at home, and others of you are working, and some of you are in a place where you can study easily, and others of you are in a place where it's very difficult. I can say, just within City University, that while the faculty are teaching from home, that is not the only thing that the institution is having us do. So we're having pretty regular meetings, and all of our other requirements, for instance, things that were contracted that we have to do, looking at personnel files and deciding who gets to go on a fellowship and who's going to get promoted, things like that, we still have to do. So it's an interesting balance that hasn't really been thought about much. And I just put it out this way, that if I were to be teaching, or any other professor were to be teaching wholly online, we'd only have about 50 to 75 students max. And some faculty are actually teaching less than that right now. Some faculty have 30 students. Whereas I think I've mentioned before, I have 150-something students. In addition to students that I mentor and to students that I provide letters of recommendation, those requests still come through. So I want you just to think about the gravity of that and how that's going to change the way that your educational career is going to go. And again, no one really knows the answer to how that's going to work out, but it's worth thinking about now. If you're following it all in the news, some law schools are thinking about, stopping, shutting down. Other schools are going bankrupt, and then some schools are figuring out ways to thrive. So you really want to think about, what does this moment mean to you, beyond kind of the cliches of personal motivation. And I read an article I think that, is worth, maybe I'll share through Blackboard, but, avoid the idea that you have to be hyper productive during this time, right? And I might point out that, on the bottom here, this is a strain. This is a physical strain. It's a mental strain. It's an economic strain. It's a social strain. So make sure you're taking some time for yourself. And, that's advice I need to follow myself. I think I've worked perhaps a bit too much. I'm not sure I've had a day off since this has started. So I wanted to put a couple pictures here just to kind of put things in perspective. So I think, like most of you I've heard from, we all are in agreement that we would prefer to be meeting in person. I don't mind teaching online, but like I said, if I were to agree to teach online, there'd be certain restrictions and things that I would want in my contract. In this situation, a fair amount of you, a pretty large number, over 30, are having, what would be just typical technical difficulties. If you were to call any corporation and you were talking to their customer service representatives. So as I explained to one student, and he agreed with me that, that's not really my job, right? I don't get paid for that. I'm doing it because I care about people, and I definitely care about my students. But, the university should be fulfilling its obligations to help you all. And I know it's not popular to be critical during a difficult time, but I think it's clear that I don't care about that. Just like in 2012, the institution, City University, is not fulfilling its obligation to you all, in addition to not to us as well. So we want to try to do the best we can. I agree with that. My colleague, Professor Brandel, has reminded us of that several times, and I think that's 100% correct. And we're just going to have to figure out how to do that. So I might think about it this way. And I'm sure many of you are in the same situation of helping out your family. I'm helping try to maintain my 6-year-old niece's education because much like New York, Washington State, it's kind of failed in this regard. She hasn't heard much from her teacher at all, actually. And so I'm in charge of teaching art and science. And I've noticed that we're doing fine, when it comes to the content from time to time. We have a little bit of problems, but most of the time we're doing really well. What she's really having a hard time with, and again, she's 6, so, we understand that she's not fully aware of the rules and social, etiquette. But she's having a hard time with this, understanding why we're in this situation and what does that mean to her. And so she's doing the best she can, but I notice that sometimes it comes out that she's really, really confused. And it struck me because I think, that's true of all of us. We're all really, really confused. I talked to several of my colleagues this week, your fellow faculty, and, we're all not really 100% sure what to do. We're doing the best we can, and we're trying to figure out how to reach you all. So if there's one thing I can say from this is, and I think I've tried to explain this to numerous students, and I appreciate your politeness, but you are not bothering me if you email me. And all I can ask is that you be as clear as you possibly can when you email to let me know what it is you need. So don't feel bad about asking me for something. Just be clear about what I can do to help you. Because like I said, this is unprecedented. So it's not like I can look back and say, well, last year I didn't do this for a student, so I'm not going to do that for you. This is going to be case by case. Each and every one of you I'm going to have to deal with individually. And so far, I haven't kept track of the exact number, but it's definitely over 30 students that I've talked to, and we've come up with something. And that's what I think we need to think about is options, moving forward. So the midterm is kind of like this, I don't know, you want to call it like a basic way, right? It's not great. In fact, it's not my favorite. If you've been in my class with me before, then you know that I really don't love simple answers, and I don't like simple questions. And so, I'm just trying to get an idea of how you're understanding. And I think one thing to point out is understanding is different than remembering. And so I'm torn here, right? Because on the one hand, if you just want to remember something, if I could be blunt, then read the Constitution of the United States word for word. Go to Cornell Legal Institute and start reading every single case as if you were a law student. And remember all of that. And then email me, and I will download a law exam and let you fail that exam. And my point here is not to be sarcastic. My point is that there's something more to education and something more to college, I believe, than memorizing a few terms and then putting those answers onto let's say a Blackboard multiple choice test, getting your 7 points, getting your C, and then you don't actually understand any of that. And I've had several students who, in fact, have gotten 100% on multiple choice exams in other classes. And I asked them, well, what do these things mean? They say, I have no idea. So it's amazing, right? So if I said like levels of educating, we say, okay, there's one that's like getting by, right? We're trying to get by, and that's the main thing. On the other hand, right, I think there's interactive individualism, right? And these are like when you have group work. And so I'm going to push a button here that's going to make the screen move. But and so, when you think about my outcomes is that, I want folks to move away from a certain way of thinking about it and thinking they're a victim or that their individual identity politics are the only thing and that there's no way that anything can change. And seeing their own kind of individual identity within a larger structure and how they can work with other people. And that's agency. And I think I can do this with all students. And I know that in the classroom, I've had success with you all. And some of you have had my classes, and we've really gotten to a deep understanding, and we've come up with really practical solutions. But as you can see, I mean, this is a lot of work that I did with a fellow professor of sociology, Professor Parker, in case any of you have taken him. And, this was our map after several months of working together on what can realistically be done to help improve the knowledge of rights, which is called rights consciousness, within the context of Kingsborough Community College, given that we have over 100 nationalities, right, represented in the classroom, or I'm sorry, on the campus. In any given classroom, if I have 42 students, I might have 42 different countries represented in that classroom. We might have, 100 languages. I mean, it's so difficult to try to get to this kind of common understanding that to get to all students requires a lot of effort and a lot of interaction. And so trying to figure out how to do this online has been something I've been working on for 10 years, maybe longer. And this is an interesting moment because some of those things are working and some of those things are very clearly not working. And so I'm going to keep pushing and I'm going to keep trying to figure out how to do this with you all. And I'm going to, go ahead and call me an optimist, I guess. So I want you to think about this. Even though I hate this concept, I'm giving in. I'm going to start entering your grade like so far. So this is what you have in this class so far. I don't find this to be a very good idea in general, but given the circumstances, I think this will help enough of you at least just feel better psychologically. And so I think that's worth something. So I'll start. It's going to take a long time. Like I said, there's 150 human beings that I have to go through, attribute a score to. And I'm going to just start, basically tomorrow and Tuesday, just entering all the people who are up to date. Your score is going to go in first. Ordinarily, I'd probably go alphabetically because that'd be a lot easier. But in this case, there's so many students I have to try to figure out what's going on. So about half of the students, so about 75 students, do not have all of their work in. And so I need to go figure out who's okay and whatnot. So just to make this simple, you're just going to see I've never used Blackboard grading before, so I don't know how exactly this will work, but you'll either see a number, a 4, which is like a 4.0, or you'll see an A. If it doesn't let me do that, then I'll have to figure out how to do some kind of number thing. But I would imagine something like, I'll just throw this out there just to think about. I'll do 4T, right? 40 for 4, 30 for 3, and then 20 for 2. And I'll show you why this matters for your final grade. I'm not going to do a points-based system here. What I'm doing is just trying to say, okay, based on what you've done so far, this is where you're at. Now, in some ways, I can't get into the details of like a B- just yet. But I'll probably be able to do that between now and the final. So I'm just going to make this somewhat simple here. Did you do at least one online assignment, and specifically the in reflection or the discussion questions? So some of you, did 3 of the assignments at the beginning, but maybe you haven't done anything since. I don't need you to do that assignment now, right? It's probably too late for that. You need to focus on what's left because there's only so many hours in a day. But what I want to do is be able to give you a score anyways. So that's where I'm kind of going with this. If you've completed a lot of work, I think you probably did well on the midterm too. Let's just be serious. And so your total grade so far is going to include both those things. Now, this is what you need to do next. And I've got kind of like 2 things here that I think are explanatory. One is the Cheshire Cat. So in Alice in Wonderland, when Alice asks him, which way should she go? He says, which way do you want to go? And she says, well, it doesn't matter. He says, well, it doesn't matter then which way you go. So I'm kind of putting this here. It's like, how much work are you able and willing to put in for this class, given that you probably have 4 other classes and who knows what else is going on in your life. So I wanted to make sure that there's options for everybody, but that they're also educationally sound, that these are, that this is not a way of just saying, well, nobody has to do anything. And I think if you do your work, you're going to get an A. And I think there'll probably be a higher level of A's this semester. And I'll be looking to give students good grades. But you have to do the work that is left. So you've done work so far, good, right? And then now you have to do this remaining work so that I can really get a sense that you actually understand the concepts in this class. So if you didn't get a 2, 3, or 4 on your midterm, like if you go into Blackboard and you don't have an A, B, or C, I'm going to email you. And that's going to be in about, next week, not this coming week. This week I'll deal with everyone who's done their work. The next week I'm going to come through email to try to figure out what's going on, which means that for the folks that are doing your work, right, I need you to do your work this week, and then I'll get to you in 3 weeks. If you did your work and you get your midterm score, then you should be, right, moving forward. Mainly with the readings, which hopefully you're already doing, but then you're going to have to do at least one more assignment if you want to get a C. So if you got a 2 on your midterm, and then you just do one more assignment out of the potential 3 or more, then you'll get a C. So you'll pass the class. And so for those of you who are going to take the class for credit and not for a grade, then that's all you have to do, one more assignment. And that can be the final exam. For those of you who want to get a B, you'll need to do at least 2 assignments, and that will have to be the final exam plus one more assignment. And then for those of you who want an A, you'll have to do all 3 assignments. So moving from a D, C, and B will require you to carefully review the outcomes. So let's remember, my goals for you, I need you to see your identity with the law, and we'll go with some of these examples of where you're not doing that. I want you to see how social change works. So if you say it doesn't work, it doesn't happen, then that's an F. That's there's like 6 stories or readings in the reader that show you that this happens. So and by the way, if you say, money rules the world, then you should understand that people with money that are in charge, that don't want change to happen, are working as hard as they can not to make it happen. And so that means change must happen, or they wouldn't spend all this time and energy trying to stop it from happening. So that is a contradiction we're going to see in this presentation that happens a lot, The other thing is that you need to start thinking about law has to be more than just obeying the law. There has to be more to that, and you're going to see why. And then I need you to really think deeply. Like, this is not an excuse to just repeat things and hope that that's going to get you through this class. So you want to focus on working to improve your grade or keep the grade you have, right? So if you get a 4 or 3 on the midterm, point, then you're just kind of keep doing the same thing. You're already doing a good job. You don't need to worry about it. If you have a 2, you need to work a little, differently. You need to try to figure out what are you not doing within the learning outcomes, and that will help you kind of improve your grade. And I'll see it, and it'll be obvious to both of us. So you can't get an A or B without completing the reading theme assignment, the final required assignment, and the final exam. Okay. You can't get an A+ without extra credit, but you can't get extra credit unless you complete those 3 assignments. So if you have a 2 and you want to do extra credit, you have to do those other 3 assignments. In other words, you can start the extra credit project. You can churn it in. But if you don't do the other 3, I'm not going to give you credit for extra credit because it wouldn't be extra in that case. I'm going to do more video lectures. In fact, I've got a lot of work I have to try to do this next week to help kind of guide you through this. This is in response to what I saw on the midterm answers and in response to conversations I've had with students, both over Zoom, over email, and from your survey responses. And then I'm going to keep using Google Forms to track your work, and this is where you can show me that you're improving your grade, right? So you want to take your time and really put out thought-out answers in those Google Forms. So you're going to choose a reading theme and complete the Google form. Okay, that's going to come up. I'm going to organize a Zoom or a Blackboard Collaborate to meet with folks if you want to. All right, so I'll send out the time and location, or time, not location, the time and URL of that information, and that will be in a few weeks. And if you have questions about the readings, that's what that will be for. I'm also going to do a final required assignment to indicate that you understand the main outcomes on this individual basis. And this is where you can improve your grade. And then for the final exam, it's going to be just like the midterm, right? You're going to have a Google form, and here are the questions. So you can start studying now. So if you want to take a picture of this, go for it. And in a few weeks, I'll give you more information to help you kind of prepare for this like super specifically based on what I kind of see from what you're doing. So this might be a good time to take a break and then come back. So you'd come back at 25 minutes. But for those of you who can keep going, these are the specific outcomes and how they're going to match up to the work that remains. And I'm not going to go through each of these things. I just want you to see, right? Like I've clumped the three together, and then that's really going to be based on what's kind of left in the readings. And so I'm going to share a podcast with my co-author or co-editor, to be technical, which is a word I've learned from my niece in the last couple of years. I can't believe I just said it now, or a couple of weeks. She loves to say everything is technical. So those are going to be just kind of getting deeper into the material. So I kind of anticipate the people who have getting 3 and a 4, where you've been doing your work consistently and you seem to get it, you feel like you get it, these are kind of for you. Like we're going to go a little bit deeper into these. For those of you who are not understanding anything, I don't need you to feel compelled to complete this work. You can. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't. You should listen to it, watch it, but don't feel any stress about it and just do the best you can. The one where I think you can make a difference in your grade, like really, show me that you're moving past what you thought before the midterm to now, will be in these reading groups. So you'll either choose gender, if that's something you're interested in, and that will be the Ginsburg-Clerk's reading and the Sotomayor reading. So just 2 readings, right? So I'm trying to make it a little bit less work, but I want you to think deeply about that content. If you're interested in class or economics or poverty, especially how it relates to knowledge, then you should do the Bell Hooks reading about class in the classroom. And then if you're interested in kind of broad level change and you think that the government uses its power against you, then you would want to read the Lessig article or reading called Remix. And it talks about specifically copyright and how file sharing really is a way of rethinking about the constitution of our social relations. If you're interested in kind of classical or history or political science or, this kind of like mainstream kind of law, or if you thought that the originalist interpretation spoke to you, then you'd want to read The Humanities in the West, which is the Hermann Hesse reading, If the War Goes On, the Adrian Rich poem in those years, and then specifically the Copeland piece, which I'll try to find a really good recording that you can listen to. But you'll want to think about, like, what is this saying about the American tradition? Like, what is the culture in America? And I'll give you this kind of cue, right? It's all about individualism, which sounds great, except there's a huge contradiction there, which I think is becoming super evident in this pandemic. So you want to think about if there's a different way to think about the previous cultural kind of deficit within the United States and how you might want to contribute to overcoming that deficit. And then for those of you who are interested in, say, psychology or behavioral economics or how do organizations change or not change, then you'd read the Brian Jones reading about the behavioral theory of change. And this would be particular for anybody who wants to go into forensics. And I'd say if you read this article or you read this reading and you don't like it, then I don't think forensics is the right direction for you. Or social work or mental health, right? These are a pretty popular concept within those fields. And here you're going to show how the material can be used to resist domination and construct a new technique for social relations. And that's how you'd show me that you're understanding this class, that power is not just one thing. Now, I also need you to do an individual contribution and show me that you're doing deep thinking, which some of you are struggling with and others are doing a great job with. So I'm going to have you find something from outside of class, and you're going to enter it onto the Google form that I'll give you, and just explain it how it applies to law and order as resistance. So I'm just going to get you to move past law as an obey or law as a command and just Go find something that shows you that it's not. And I don't think this is going to be that hard, honestly. So, you're going to find a song, a poem, literature, film, documentary, news story, anything. It doesn't really matter. Anything. A picture, it could be anything. Just showing me how people are fighting back against the law. And ideally, this would be they're fighting against the law legally, right? So a protest or something like that. But it doesn't have to be, right? If you can explain it, then, because like for instance, right, in 1832, if a slave were to try to rescue their family and flee, right, run away, that would be illegal, right? And yet that's still a sign of resisting, right? Or if you put it even more concretely, if you looked at law as a command or an obeyment, then the Declaration of Independence is illegal. Then the revolution is illegal. So the entire country is illegal, right? So you can start to see why this is a naive point of view. Then there's 4 extra credit assignments, and I'd prefer you only do one of these. And I'll give you more information in a couple weeks, but you feel free to start, kind of going. The first one will be about the Supreme Court, and you're going to kind of go through each of the members, all 9 of them, and you're going to talk about how they view the law as an institution. So how do they view the Supreme Court or the courts generally? How do they view the instrument of the court? How should lawsuits be used? How should judges make decisions? And then what's their ideology? How are they basing this? What is this based on? Extra credit 2 will be to make something that's called a zine. I'm going to give you a couple examples from Barnard at Columbia, and this is going to be about resistance. So you'll make a zine about resistance. Extra credit 3 will be to find an OER. It's called an open educational resource somewhere on the internet for legal education. So it'd be an OER about legal education, and you're going to email it to me. It must satisfy all requirements there's a blog out there by David Wiley, and there's 5 elements of an OER. So you don't get credit unless it satisfies all 5 elements of that. And so I'll share that information with you again in a couple weeks. And then extra credit 4, 2 to 3 page essay. How do the course materials apply to the COVID crisis and governmental response, or on governmental social relations in your neighborhood? You can do either or. One student has already sent this in, which I thought was great, and they did a really fantastic job. So I thought, I'll extend this out as an extra credit for everybody. Now, the 4-3-2 thing, and it's A, B, C. So deep thinking, let's start with that, right? Let me show you what is not deep thinking, so the C-. The learner struggles to understand the main concepts in the course, is not ready for the readings, or is struggling in college readiness, or maybe resisting the material for personal reasons. I think these are all valid things, right? I mean, this happens every semester. A handful of students have this particular problem. But there's not really much I can do about it, right? And especially in the online environment. If you're just kind of resisting and pushing against the work, what can I do? In the classroom, we could have dialogue. I could get other students to kind of talk to you. But over this kind of platform, the best I can do for you is give you a C-. So let's see if you can move towards a B, which would be just clearly express how you can advocate for change as a member of a targeted community and apply the reading to your own experience, showing that you are thinking about the application of knowledge for advocacy. So I'm not saying that you have to be Thurgood Marshall. I'm not saying you have to be Ginsburg. I'm not saying you have to be Sotomayor. I'm not saying you have to be Patricia Collins. I'm saying you have to understand that they were able to use the law to advocate for their social group. So you are able, and you don't have to do it, but you have to show that you understand that it is a choice. You can choose not to. I mean, that's your American right. But it's not evidence of learning in a college classroom. So A students, if you want to just think about it, are the students who empathize with those who are different than them. And they can see how laws of power to dominate and to resist works in everyday life, and has something to say about how they can advocate for change to benefit from the status quo or from domination. So they can say, look, I see how this all works out, and I benefit from this. And that's evidence of learning. They can see the whole picture. It doesn't mean that they're going to go out and change everything tomorrow. And that's not an outcome of this course, as you'll see. if you went through each of these kind of just basic things I provide, and I'll give you all this information on the website, but if you see this, it's not so difficult, right? So let's look at the difference between an A and a C on just a couple of these. So if you see your identity with law, then you are evidencing your learning by identifying with a reading or showing how the identity is different from the reading. So you don't have to agree with it. You can say it's not like this. But a C minus, a non-passing grade, is the learner, you're struggling to relate to the readings or cannot evidence understanding from lived experience. So it's like you're saying you don't have any lived experience, or you didn't do the reading, one of the two. Skipping down, you'll see like move beyond the laws, only obey. This learner clearly talks about groups, right? They understand it, they get it, and they see that groups can resist domination. And so they see that they can do this not by blowing up a building, but by saying, wait a second, there's a contradiction here in the law. It says all men are created equal, and yet you're treating this group of men differently than this group. Or they say, if the 14th Amendment says that you can't discriminate against a person, how come these people are getting discriminated against? And then they identify what are the reasons for that. Is it power? Is it money, right? Is it influence? What is it? And that's very clear that they see that law is not just obeying, right? Not all laws are worth obeying. Versus the C minus is saying, look, they can only see the law as rules that they must be obeyed, even if those rules are going to harm them. So if the rule is for you to commit suicide and you say, I think that's a great idea, then you're kind of stuck in this way of seeing law that isn't practical, it isn't realistic, and it's harmful. And then an individual contribution, right, is that the learner does not think that this class applies to them, which is mind-boggling to me, because this is not like an elective class, right? This is first of all, if you're a criminal justice major, then this is a very important class before you transfer or become a cop. I pray that you understand this material if you're going to be out on the streets and be a police officer. But kind of secondly, it's like this class is all about the order of society, right? So as long as you live here or have influence under the United States government, then this class is extremely relevant to you. So you'll see in some of these answers that the students are doing well is that they get this, they understand this. So this is not a learning outcome that I think needs too much reflection. I think it should be self-evident. But you have to kind of understand that the world is bigger than yourself and that the law is not probably for you, right? You didn't design it. However, right, I organized this visual to show you that each of the readings relates to the law as the United States Constitution, and that's why they were selected. I'll say again, these readings are readings that so-called elite students know by heart. And many of them learn them in, like the 8th grade. So they might not speak directly to your experience, right? But if you get on a subway, then someone on that subway has had one of these experiences. If you go to the hospital, right, somebody has had these experiences. I'm sure some of you hate biology, right? You're not interested in taking that class. However, aren't you glad that the doctors took biology? And aren't you glad that scientists took biology to understand this virus, a biological virus? And that's what I'm trying to get at here is that, if everyone had a better understanding of how law and power works, then I don't know for sure, but I think we'd at least have better conversations about it. And so you might want to take a picture of this, but I'll share it with you on the website as well. But I just want you to see that these are different interpretations of what the law means. And so you can kind of see that each of these, and in the parentheses here, I'm putting like, what's the ideology there, right? And so if you say, for example, and this one, kind of confuses me sometimes, why students put this answer, but if they say like, I think that the originalists are correct, well, you probably would not be welcome in this country then, because that was a principle, as you'll see from the Declaration of Independence, was the ideal of equality for Englishmen. I'm not sure if any of us would actually be in this country if we were to apply strictly how they viewed the world in 1776. And so I think, I'm not saying that you shouldn't, think that that's an interesting way of interpreting the Constitution, but I think you need to understand that that's not your identity, right? That the law is not going to see you that way. Now, getting into kind of the practical details, I think you can see, one question most of you had no problem with. The other question you seem to have some trouble with. So, when we think about this question, right, in the Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court of the United States interpreted the Constitution using, it should be clear, its originalist ideology, right? Live or Let Live is a Beatles song, I believe. Freedom First ideology sounds like something that might come out of the Trump campaign. And then, looks like this is hard for the colorblind people, right? But liberal ideology, right, for the green one. I'm not even really sure what that is. I think, there's no such thing as like a liberal ideology, but the person probably thought it was like politics, right? But liberalism in the West, right, which is what this country is based on, along with England and Germany and Spain and France and Italy, all have this concept of autonomy, right, a freedom of the individual, but that's balanced with the social, right? So collective and security, right? So welfare, health benefits, things like that are balanced with individual freedom. That's a liberal ideology in that sense. The originalist ideology is the ideology that the Supreme Court used when they said that because African Americans were not recognized as humans in 1776, that they should continue not to be recognized as humans in the 1850s. So if you agree with originalist principles, and again, some people are racist, so you'd be saying the same thing. You'd be saying that in 2020, African Americans should not be considered to be citizens because that is the originalist interpretation. So I get confused about this only simply because I'm not sure people are really thinking about it deep enough to understand what they're saying. And then in response to this, right, because I'm showing you that's power one, that's law one, that's domination, that's law as obey, you must do it. Too bad for you if you're African American. But on the other hand, look what Dred Scott does, right? He doesn't submit. In fact, he redefines the label that was forced on him, and he pursues his idea of liberty. It's interesting that so many of you understood this, right? I think it probably speaks to your life and your understanding of what labeling is. Now, you might take a break here as well and then come back at 42 minutes because the rest I'm going to get into real critical understanding of the midterm responses, and that will help you figure out how you can do better on your final exam. So I want you to think about this. If law is simply a command to be obeyed by everyone, or they will face the consequences, it sounds like a parent scolding, right? Then why do so many people not get caught? They get rewarded, or they change or avoid the law just by using money. Just for one example, in other words, if law is a command and you're going to get punished for not following it, then why do so many people not follow it, and why do they not get punished? So another way of thinking about that is that I've been conducting some research to kind of help folks, legal scholars, criminal justice professors, and lawyers to think about how should we talk about law in a way that non-lawyers understand. Because so many non-lawyers seem to see law as a command, how can we consider this? So I thought one way was let students inform what would be the best way of teaching. And so it's interesting as I'm going through this research for a book project, 46 students, over time have identified racism or race as an issue as the most significant factor of injustice in the United States. Now, again, if you go to law school, I think this will be common. You'll say, yes, of course, right? Slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow laws, today's police brutality. It becomes so obvious that it's a principal injustice of the legal system that shows that there is not justice for all. And so law cannot simply be a command because otherwise we'd be saying that African Americans in particular should be targeted. And again, some people are racist, so they're entitled to that opinion. But I don't think that is the majority viewpoint of Kingsborough students. And so when students are saying that this is a major issue, this means that it is something that we are all seeing and that we know to be a real issue. And so that means that there must be something going on besides law as this kind of moral command. If you look at all of these issues, though, immigration discrimination, poverty, gender discrimination, violence and domestic violence, physical violence and guns, unequal educational opportunities, religious discrimination, and transgendered and sexuality discrimination, you'll see there are laws against this, right? There's laws against behaving this way, and yet people are behaving this way regularly and not getting punished. So if law is a command, people aren't following that commandment. And so perhaps just like a moral code, if you sin, it doesn't seem like there are any consequences in the immediate effect. So there has to be something more to it than just that. So I want to give you 4 different perspectives then. The first one of the 4 was the one that many of you kind of started with in this class, and many of you are starting to understand is not the right way to think about it, which is naive. It's this idea that everyone's following the law, In fact, lots of people aren't following the law. If I break the law, there will be consequences. Well, no, not necessarily. In fact, I bet you everyone in the class has jaywalked, and I guarantee you didn't get a ticket. Now, if you go to somewhere else, you might get a ticket. So, you want to think about that. What rules are being enforced where really depends on where you're at. And so this idea that if everyone is following the law everywhere is incredibly naive, right? I would even add, naive means childish. So it's great if you're a kid and you think like this and the world seems like roses and lollipops. But when you become an adult and you go to college, this is where you learn this is not how the world works. So the other idea is that, some people get confused. Well, everybody just doesn't understand the law the same, and that's why they're breaking the law. No. When people fraud people out of money, they understand the law very well. When people launder money for drug cartels, they understand the law very well, right? I mean, a lot of people who violate the social code are very educated, are very knowledgeable about what the law is, and that's how they get away with it. So, we have to kind of differ. And I wish, and this is a hard thing that we're trying to figure out in the criminal justice program, but I wish in like intro to criminal justice or in your criminology class, crime and punishment, you would have spent some time looking at statistics so that you would have seen that the overwhelming number of crimes in this country are either financial or property crimes. They're not physical violence. And so it would shift your mind towards what some people call the civil law system, even though they're both related. And they're really one and the same thing. But, it would get you to see that we're not talking about physical crime when we're talking about following the law. 99% of the law has nothing to do with crime of physical kinds. So if you started using the phrase as if, like if you said the law is as if a moral code, and everyone does at least one immoral thing, then a code is not very realistic if we're talking about social relations. In other words, just writing something down on a piece of paper and carrying it out in front of people, like do not steal my money. If you just carried a sign that says, please don't steal my money, it's not going to stop anyone from stealing your money. So we want to think about then, well, what is going on? So if we just look at the text, and I'm going to just think about the text of the 14th Amendment, the text of the Declaration of Independence, the text of the Preamble of the United States, and then the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. I think if you thought about these for a little while, then you might change your perception. So here are 3 scholarly, academic schools of thought, right? However you want to think about it, college level ways of thinking about law. One is it's the oldest, but it's also the most common for that reason, which is the elitist. That, law is for the defined citizens to increase the number of taxpayers. So in the 14th Amendment, they wanted to, this is the argument that the 14th Amendment was there to increase the number of taxpayers, to decrease the number of votes, to increase the number of people who would participate in that given jurisdiction, okay? Maybe versus, right, the pluralist, which is they're saying, no, the 14th Amendment was a compromise between anti-slavery groups and pro-slavery. And in this particular battle, legislative battle, the anti-slavery groups won. Okay, but there's also another way that says, well, it's not one or the other, it's both, right? And maybe even more. It's the limit of law is absolute. Poor whites and non-whites saw class consciousness of rights. They came together to fight in the Civil War. Same thing with women. To try to resist this domination of like unlimited power. That's one group. The slaveholders were saying that they could do whatever they wanted. So this group said, no, that's not the way the law works. And so they resist. And so that's kind of what we're trying to get you to see here, is that, resistance is a form of law. Same thing if we look at the Declaration of Independence. Elitist position would say it's written for white slaveholders. Pluralists say it was a compromise between white slaveholders and non-slaveholders. The dialectic is, no, this was unjust enrichment and moral concerns. That's why it leads to a conflict, right? It's not just like, okay, we accept it. This is the way it is. This was a compromise, and now it's in the Constitution. No, this was seen as one side getting more than they were entitled to. It was seen as pro-slave people using slave labor to get unfairly rich and using that power against other people. And so this became a moral concern. They were saying this isn't correct. And a great example is that George Mason. And so you could read that writing. I mean, there's lots of Frederick Douglass. Lots of folks have written about this. Martin Luther King Jr. It becomes a moral concern after the economic kind of situation sets in, that this is incredibly unfair. It's unfair to use slave labor and then say that you did that. I'm the rich person. I didn't have any problems. Everything's great. So this is a group of people using power to try to dominate everybody else. And so people say, no, that's not fair. So then when you get to the preamble of the United States, right, then it's different now. A more perfect union could be just for state elites. It could be just for money interests. It could be a compromise between religious folks, between people who want, give me liberty, give me death, Patrick Henry types. But probably more, realistic would be it's an economic document. It's between slave traders, bankers who are funding the slave trade practice, lawyers, and small farmers and communitarians like John Adams and whatnot in Massachusetts it's a balance. They're trying to figure out, well, how do you order society given that people have different interpretations of what they think law is? Try to remember that pro-slave holders believed the law was on their side. They were interpreting the law to say, well, we get to do what we want. Whereas, right, lawyers are trying to figure those out, looking at the common law, looking at the history of law. The bankers are saying, well, we want to make profits, so we want the law to support what we're saying. And then moral, religious folks were saying, well, the law is not in agreement with the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. But then other people were saying, no, look right here. Jesus says if you're a slave, you'll always be a slave. So people are arguing about these things, and they're trying to support it on themselves. That's the reality of the social structure. So when we get to the text of the Declaration of Human Rights, then you can see, now, is this just from elite position? Is this just the United States? And this is, Russia says this, right? Trying to just expand global capitalism, using the law to justify it. Or is it a battle, right? Is it a construction of interests? Like, basically, they come to a compromise saying, like, okay, war happens, but war for economic gain should be illegal, okay? Or is it the space? Is it the United Nations? This is what I think Eleanor Roosevelt had in mind when she was helping draft it, was that it's a place for folks to come talk about these things. And the idea is that if you can come talk about it peacefully, then you won't be going to war. You won't be dominating. And so here you see rights consciousness coming out through here, saying like more and more people are starting to accept the fact that we need equality in economic social relations. This is coming out right now. And hopefully folks are able to use places like legal venues to have a dialogue about this, to make an agreement. Or, unfortunately, very likely, you're going to see violence. So now I want you just to consider some of the responses from the students and try to put them into these categories. So again, elitist, pluralist, or a dialectic, which side are they really falling into, or is it a naive point of view? So when you see an answer that says, my mother says, if not, you break the rule that comes with consequences, this is that naive position. Now, again, this is a very common misconception. Not even a misconception, right? Because if this person has a mother like my mother, then there were consequences. And so this is true, right? If you go punch a police officer in the face, there's going to be consequences, right? If you go try to rob a bank, you're probably going to get caught, and there's going to be consequences, right? However, if you're a political candidate and you sexually abuse one of your staffers, it appears that there will not be any consequences, political or criminal. And so I think, it's tough to like make such a blanket statement because there's so many exceptions to the rule. Now, this is another interesting point, right? Other people on social media define it as unfair. And they say nothing changed and nothing ever will. Well, the problem with this idea is there were no cops in 1776. In fact, police had a completely different meaning than that. It was a governmental idea. It wasn't a having people on the streets kind of idea. And so things change all the time, right? I do agree, however, that the media does not, and social media in particular, which I think is a dumber version of the media, if you can believe it, do not portray change very well. I think one thing that has made Governor Cuomo so popular, I've heard from people, is the use of charts which show change over time. Well, the media doesn't do that, right? They're not very good at showing, well, this is what we said about Trump in November. This is what we're saying about Trump now, right? They don't really do that. It's always, what did we say today? What do we think today? It's ridiculous. I mean, how many times have you read an article that said, this is going to destroy Trump's presidency, and then the next day nothing happened, right? So sensationalizing is not a academic way of thinking. Now, this other one, that means our limit is touching someone without their consent, and that's where you stop. Well, if you're paying any attention to the Me Too movement or to these, political allegations against Biden, against Trump, right? I mean, clearly that's not where it stops, right? Men seem to take advantage of this quite a bit, and then they don't suffer any consequences. I would define law as a guideline to what is legal and illegal to do. Well, I would agree, but, this is a pretty bad example that the person then gives, right? It's illegal to have an unregistered gun in your possession, but I would venture to say that everyone who has an unregistered gun in New York has it in their possession. And it's only illegal if they get caught with it. And then in some situations, people have had registered guns in their possession, and based on other reasons, they have been thrown in jail. So I think the problem of wrongful conviction really kind of comes up here, is that some people are in jail for not doing it. They didn't do anything. And so it's not a good guide then, right? Law is not a good guide because law is not a thing, right? Police officers enforce the law. Judges enforce the law. Law doesn't enforce itself. Now, law is all of the things that put in place to keep people safe. Now, this is interesting because this person is trying to establish a structural framework here, right? It's not one thing. It's a multitude of things. The problem is that they then contradict themselves by saying the creators and the enforcers and the interpreters maintain the peace. Well, no, because, right, the creator of a law could be a lobbyist who wants to get tax exemptions for bringing in 14-year-old girls, that will be used for sex trafficking. And if you don't think that that's happening, right, then there's lots of information you need to go read about. For example, you cannot get a wiretap on someone if they're bringing in a human being, but you can get a wiretap on somebody if they're trying to bring in drugs. So, it's not like law is not, just for or against, right? It's also about the rules. It's about when can police, get wiretaps? When do they have probable cause? I mean, there's so many different levels of thinking about this that the idea that there are creators and enforcers maintaining the peace, well, that wouldn't be law, right? That would be ruled by men. That wouldn't be ruled by law. And so law has to be something that's political, that's debated, there isn't a right answer. So then there's, law means to those who withhold power, and that slavery never ended, and it was reformed in a different system in a way that would be in the Constitution. Now, this is the opposite of what those other answers said, so I want you to think about that. Right? How can this answer be correct and those answers be correct? Or are these opinions about the law, and are some of them based on fact? This one's based on fact, right? We can actually see this through the Jim Crow laws. We can see this through the unequal treatment. We can see it, right? There's statistics, there's stories, there's pictures, there's videos, right? There's tons of testimony. There's people admitting they were doing this in the Nixon administration. I like this next answer because this is getting towards a better idea of understanding the law isn't just about yourself. I haven't experienced it yet, but there are many of my friends that have. So they're starting to see that the law is not enforced uniformly. It is not enforced consistently, and that there are contradictions. People have to give up their rights like freedom. This is called social order. So that's interesting because that means that the people who are being targeted, African Americans, immigrants, women, children, they're the ones who have to give up their freedom so that other people can have unlimited freedom. So this goes back to that idea that law is a command. Well, this answer doesn't fit well within this situation. And then, as a middle-class white, I have not had any of these struggles. Probably not, I agree. But these aren't drastic moments in history to the folks who live with it every day. But of course it's a drastic position from a white folks, right? White folks don't understand these problems, and especially middle-class white folks. But if you were to talk to poor white folks, then they definitely understand these problems. And so, again, this is the whole point of law and identity. You need to start to see that the law doesn't just apply to you. Now, that gets us to these kind of problematic answers. So one person just put NA, right? Not available. Okay, right? Then that's no grade. I have no relation to the book at all. Well, that's impossible, right? You don't have to like it. You can resist the information, but this statement is not realistic. This is two different ways of saying the same thing, right? I've never been or had to fight for equality of rights. But then this person goes off and says, most of the world agrees that everyone is equal. That does not seem to be evident through, again, statistics, the amount of war, poverty. I mean, there's just too many things to go through to show that that's not true. And then especially in the United States, the law supports you in any case. How would this person explain wrongful conviction, right? People being put away. Also, like for women who come forward after being abused or raped, and then nothing happens, right? They don't get any support. And then this other one that's really confusing. I can only assume that this was coming from some other, like they heard this from someone, but this is from the constitutional perspective instead of the criminal aspect, as if the criminal aspect is somehow different than the constitutional aspect. Again, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's also based in common law principles, and criminal law comes out of those two things. So you can't have criminal law without constitutional law. One great example would be Terry versus Ohio, which is what allows, the Supreme Court has given the power to police officers, even though it's not in the Constitution, to stop folks based on who they want. And since the 70s, it's been very clear about who they want to stop, and that's African Americans, and that they've shot African Americans without probable cause, without reasonable suspicion, without anything at all. And so that's obviously a constitutional issue. I'd also, some folks think that they don't live in a segregated environment, but there's a map you can look up online and see if you live in a segregated environment. And if you do, that is unconstitutional and it is illegal. In fact, to do anything that is unconstitutional is illegal. It is a criminal event. So, these answers are just showing that the person is struggling. But it also shows me as an educator, as a teacher, that they don't understand the readings. And so you can't get a good grade in this class, meaning a C, a passing grade, if you can't show me that you understand what you're reading. On the other hand, right, here's a great answer of deep thinking, right? The person is able to take their lived experience and compare it to a reading. This person very likely did most of the readings, if not all of them. And when they got to this reading, they had so much information and they're understanding the information that this reading spoke to them. And so they're able to pull out very particular instances that are similar to the experience of other folks in the reader. And I don't think you have to be from the same labeled group in order to understand this, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to liberty everywhere should be common sense unless you're resisting that sense. This is interesting. I am never searched or pulled aside because I am white. I think that's so unnecessary to treat people different because of their skin or nationality. So you see this as an opposite position of the lived experience. And then another person says, right, that their lived experience is similar to the politics of land reform, right? They're saying that like freedom means the freedom to do something illegal, like have slavery. And when they're using legal, illegal here, what they're saying is that, right, law can be a moral code. So you don't enslave humans. That's not, that's immoral. But on the other hand, law as private property is contradicting that human right, that moral code idea. So you've got this, then it goes to this kind of third idea, is that just like landowners getting their property taken away, people get their privacy, right? Their intellectual property, their computer property, their digital rights get taken away. So again, you think you have a legal right, or that law protects you and protects you against people doing illegal things, but here you've got, in both situations, the government doing the illegal thing. Very difficult to get justice from a government that is violating your rights. So here you should start to see the contradiction. And this is, getting us one step further, because the interpretation, the words matter. So this person very clearly identified a quote from letter from a Birmingham jail, even though they're not from the same socially labeled group. And they said, I've also stated law can be used as a weapon against you. I said this because, in fact, the law has been used against my community throughout the battle that this person went through. So they even go through the details of saying how this can be used against you, right? So one form of law can be used against a different one. And so this is what I'm looking for, that you don't have to say that I totally agree with this person, but you should be able to, because we live in the United States of America under the same laws, you should have some awareness outside of your own two eyes. Now, I think this is where we all want to be, right? So this student is getting to understand the contradiction, and they're explaining the contradiction. So they see that, they think that the law should be permanent, right? That the law really should be ideal. Of course, wouldn't that be great if everyone were to do the right thing every day, never made any mistakes, and we all, there was only like 2 rules. Wouldn't that be amazing? No one would ever have to really worry about it. But they say, look, but I'm seeing now that my lived experience is different than these other people's lived experience that I'm reading about. That's the key. Because if your lived experience is different than other people's lived experience in the same country with the same laws, then law cannot be universal. It cannot be something that is objectively applied to every situation equally. And if that's the case, then it's a contradiction. So if we start thinking about law as ideal and then law as if real, then we want to compare what is law if it was ideal versus how it's really going on. And this is going to explain how law is being used by different groups. So some of you might disagree. My job is to teach you something that you do not yet understand, assuming you want to learn. So how can you make sense of the fact that you're living within a constitutional structure evidenced by the readings in the book, but you seem to believe that you live outside of it? You haven't quite placed yourself inside of the law. So that's something for you to think about. The second thing, for those students who feel the constitutional structure deeply, which is a lot of you, okay, 45 of you, feel this deeply, you understand injustice very clearly. How can you see the world from the point of view of the people who don't? And I know that's tough, right? But since you occupy the same space, right, nothing is going to change, is correct, if we can't speak to one another, if we can't share information with each other about how we go through life differently, then of course nothing's going to change. But, right, we want to think about how can we see the world from another point of view. And then this is a hard thing I'm trying to think about, and these are two difficulties that I'm going to be working on with you. So let's work on this together. In other words, how can I best explain to you what stare decisis is? Because many of you seem to not be too clear on this. I know some of you might have memorized the definition of it, but you never understood it, right? You just memorized it, and so you picked it on a ABCD thing, And the teacher didn't bother, I guess, getting into detail about it, okay? And some of these people are my friends, right? But we have to be just as critical with our friends as we are with our enemies. Stare decisis binds future laws, binds, right? Holds tight, constrains lawyers, judges, and us. This is a way of thinking about law. This is an interpretation. This is an ideology. It doesn't mean we have to do it, but it has a very strong effect. It has a very strong effect on how people think about it. And so stare decisis is one of those rules. It's one of those commands. And so if people don't resist that idea, then we're stuck thinking in the same way as folks did 200 years ago. Now, this form of knowledge, and really knowledge production, is called abduction. You say it is as this other thing. That's where I'm trying to get you to use the language in this class. This is also called legal reasoning, which is based on logical reasoning, which is based on metaphysics and philosophy. Again, we don't have to do this, but this is the way that most folks do in the legal world. So if you're going to be a Justice Academy student, if you're going to be a police officer, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to go into criminal justice, you're going to have to get used to this. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to figure out ways of resisting and of redefining and of constructing a dialectic of saying, what's the difference between the ideal and the real? How does this work for rich folks? How does this work for poor folks? If you're in the middle class, I feel for you, right? You're in the middle. It's tough to see what it's like to be on the ends, but you're going to have to try, right? So trying to see it from multiple point of views. Now, I'm also going to try to explain that there's no substantial difference. There's no difference in substance between what's called criminal law, civil law, constitutional law. But that's what makes this class hard for people to teach. I mean, if you're not an expert in this field and you don't do your research and you're not staying constant, you could get this confused pretty easily. So I'm trying to figure out how can I explain this to folks who don't spend as much time reading and thinking about this as I do, right? I'm sure it's the same thing for people who are playing a musical instrument or who draw, right? I mean, it's like, how do you explain what you do to people who don't spend as much time doing it as you do? And this is a very particularly difficult thing. I think the easiest thing to do is just because most of you have taken some classes that give you history, that the common law, the constitutional law, and think about it this way, just think about it this way. That law constitutes our social relations. Constitutes, constitution, constitutional is the state of mind that we enter and agree with each other. And we're going to play by those rules. If you're playing a board game, a video game, right? Those are the rules we're going to play by. How people behave once they start playing that game, that's not constitutional law. That's not common law. So what is that? That's called positive law. And since the Great Depression in the 1930s, lots of lawyers, lots of scholars, lots of judges have thought, well, if you just tweak the game just right, if you just change this rule in this video game, then no one will cheat. And for those of you who play video games, you should be laughing at home. Somebody's always going to cheat. And sometimes you should cheat. If the rule is stupid, if the rule is not equally applied, if the rule is not moral, then why would you follow it? And that's the difference, right? So if we don't participate, which none of us did, in the constitutional order that made the rules, we shouldn't just blindly follow this. And I'm giving you a little bit of a lecture here, but this is a strange myth to me, right? Because it's so foreign to my way of thinking. I'm so far out of this that I'm trying to remember what it must be like to think of these things as different domains. And so it's going to take me some time. So I'm asking for your patience here. And I'll keep trying to think of how to explain this. But I think, right, if you're reading the readings and you're thinking about the discussion questions, and now you do these last assignments, especially the one where you go out into the world and you find what I call an artifact. You find a poem, you find a song, you find a video, right, that talks about resistance. Now it's time for you to use your analytical skills, right, which you're in college, you have these skills, you're able to do it. Why are these people resisting? Is the law unfair? Is it being used inappropriately? Does it need to be changed? And if you think that this is a deep, deep, deep-rooted issue that goes back into history and as a structure of our social relations, then you're probably going to be more interested in fundamental rights, human rights, natural law, okay? If you think that we can change just a little bit here and there, change the procedure, change the set of rules over here and hope that it works over here, then you're probably more interested in economics. You're more interested in enforcement, okay? And nobody knows the answer. There's no right answer there. This is human population. There's 300 million Americans, right? So that's why they called it the Great Experiment. But we need to see it from beyond just the rich, beyond just the powerful, and beyond just the poor. We need to see it as a collection of everybody. And that's that dialectic model. And that's what I'm looking for, that you can see beyond your own point of view. You need to see it from your point of view so that you can put yourself into the situation so that you can actually make these kind of judgments. But you also need to see that you're side by side next to somebody else, which is, I'm telling you, this is very difficult in this moment. Okay? And so I just wanted to kind of go through this in extreme detail to provide as much information as I possibly can. So again, I will be sharing lots more information with you as we move forward and giving you lots more resources.